So good evening. I'm Robert Polito of the New School Writing Program, and I want to welcome you to this memorial tribute to Harry Mathews. Let me thank at the outset Trevor Winkfield for his many resourceful actions towards tonight. Thank Anna Moore for first introducing Harry to the New School Writing Program. Thank Lynn Turner of our office for her expert and elegant ministrations. And thank, of course, Marie Schechts. Harry was immensely and multiply gifted: novelist, poet, essayist, short story writer, translator, the first American of Oulipo, and co-editor with John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, and James Schuyler of the axial international literary journal Locus Solus. For a time, around the turn of this century, Harry also was a New School professor, initially of an MFA literature seminar, and very soon after that of an elusive and ultimately legendary two-end weekend workshop that could only be called, as we promptly titled it, Masterclass with Harry Mathews. Here is Harry's sly description. The purpose of the workshop is not the usual one of developing the ability to write well or better. Its aim is to dissolve the reticence and anxieties that beset most writers, whatever the extent of their talent and experience. All the actual writing called for by the workshop is done collectively in class. The workshop is open to writers working in all genres. Uninterrupted attendance on both days is an absolute requirement. There is a break for lunch. I have a small collection of high school yearbooks that include people, mostly writers, artists, and musicians, who interest me, and Harry's is among those yearbooks. One of the wonders of the 1947 Groton School yearbook, and this isn't always true for people in their yearbooks, is that the Harry you meet there in those now 70-year-old pages is pretty much the same extraordinary person I met at that Soho lunch with honor. Here is the official caption next to his photo and the news that he's headed to Princeton. Dynamic Harry Mathews, often called Mathews, M-A-T-H-O-O-Z, is usually found exulting over some new discovery, be it a ravishing beauty, an obscure poet, or a symphonic tune. He does everything eagerly and intensely while preserving an appearance of relaxed self-assurance. He has the peculiar gift of being able to laugh at the world and yet be an active and sometimes laughable part of it. You may find him discussing T.S. Eliot with Mr. Strachan, Picasso with Mrs. Beasley, Beethoven with Purdue, the Distaff with Osborne, or playing basketball in the snow with Taylor or squash with Harper. Harry succeeds in spreading himself out without spreading himself too thin. It is probable that he will never enter any profession, but will invent one instead. Inventing a profession, a life for himself, that's exactly what Harry did. And here are a few more lines about Harry from elsewhere in that Groton yearbook, a more casual section designated Form Notes. Mathews, another of the St. Bernard boys, would begin a conversation with, "Oh, have you read?" He was always seen with a book under his arm, but seldom would he be found twice with the same one. As preparation for life at Groton, he had read Mein Kampf. He would spend long afternoons discussing with Mr. Pick the, quote, third phase of Gerard Manley Hopkins. In his third form year, he was editor of the Weekly, and in 1946, he became editor-in-chief of the Grotonian. Mathews also proved that he possessed real creative gifts in music as well as literature. So that's a bit of a glimpse of Harry back in 1947 and at the New School in 2004. I was honored that he taught here, honored to read him, and honored to be among his many friends. One year, he mailed me from France a copy of the rare final volume of Locus Solus with a sweet note and the very same fountain pen signature on display in the Groton yearbook. So let me now turn the occasion over to Harry's dear friend, Trevor Winkfield.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to thank you for arranging for us to use the New School as the venue for this evening's event. and a thank you to Bill Corbett, who first suggested the new school as a possible venue. To put my friendship with Harry Mathews into some kind of historical perspective, I knew my father for 39 years, my mother for 44 years, and Harry for 50 years. So it was a relationship like no other. I first came across Harry's name in 1966 after attending a Fluxus event in the basement of Better Books in London's Charing Cross Road. As I was leaving the event, which involved the muscular artist Robin Page attempting to dig his way with a pickaxe to the center of the earth via the bookshop's concrete floor, unsuccessfully, I might add, I saw on a table upstairs, not far from the front door, a small green journal with the title Locus Solus. It turned out to be the journal edited by Harry, John Ashbery, Jimmy Schuyler, and Kenneth Koch. It was Kenneth who had edited this special issue, devoted to collaborations. The journal was so nice and clean, though it had been published 5 years previous, that after I bought it, I rushed home, washed my hands, and spent the remainder of the afternoon devouring it. Amongst other revelations, it contained the second part of Harry's first novel, The Conversions, which was so enthralling, I wrote to Harry asking where I could buy back issues of the magazine. A couple of weeks later, I received a reply mailed from the British Embassy in Laos. Laos? But surely I'd just read somewhere that Laos was strictly off limits to travelers at that stage of the Vietnam War. Which was no doubt the initial puzzled reaction of most people when they first had contact with Harry. Was Harry in CIA? A spy? Very shady. Anyway, after reading extracts of Harry's novel, I managed to track down the actual book, which was, to coin an Englishism, just my cup of tea. I couldn't believe I'd discovered someone who thought just like me. I followed this discovery by tracking down Harry's early poems in the most obscure small magazines imaginable, which in the 1960s were only accessible in ill-lit university libraries, with no copying facilities apart from blunt pencils. At this point, I began writing to Harry with some frequency, and when I graduated from art school in 1967, Harry offered me the use of his Paris apartment in the Rue de Varenne for a few days, even moving out to give me more room. Imagine my surprise when I buzzed Harry's apartment and was greeted not by the tweedy professor with patched elbows and dangling pipe that his writing had led me to expect, but a dashing and very handsome playboy in velvet pants and a purple silk shirt. I myself was 23 at the time, but socially I was a totally gauche 13-year-old, and so broke that I pretended the striped waiter's jacket I was wearing was actually the English version of seersucker. I didn't fool anyone. That very evening of my arrival, Harry whisked me off to dinner on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, where one of the other guests was Marcel Plainet, a biographer of the Comte de Lautréamont and leading light of the Tel-Quel group of writers, someone whom I'd admired from afar for a long time. After 2 glasses of expensive wine, the only kind that Harry drank, I was in aesthetic heaven. The drabness of England seemed a long, long way away. It was Harry's example of American generosity, his kindness and openness during this visit, which led directly to my decision 2 years later to move permanently to the United States, where soon after my arrival, I published Harry's first book of poems, The Ring, using an old-fashioned mimeograph machine. In an edition of 200 copies, with a cover by Joe Brainard. It's worth noting that just one copy of this book now fetches more than 3 times the amount of the original printing costs of 200 copies. One of many things I admired about Harry was his wholehearted acceptance of Emily Dickinson's viewpoint, tell the truth, but tell it slant. He was always seeing things and situations from unexpected angles. I'd first stumbled across this gift of Harry's when reading his second novel, Sleuth, in 1966, a book in which there appears a scene involving a Russian lieutenant who had defended himself against bandits using a wall of rusk sacks. Note, Harry did not describe them as rucksacks, such as a lieutenant might be expected to carry, but as rusk sacks, a typical Mathewsian trick of fooling both eye and mind, of seeing the world differently, which found parallels in Harry's daily observations, some of which he passed on to me and thus helped me to adjust to New York in the early 1970s. For instance, on a 100-degree summer's day in Manhattan, Harry patiently explained that opening the house door in this brutally hot weather was just like opening an oven door at full blast, an image which helped me reconcile somewhat to New York. Another time, he described the geography of Manhattan as islands of apartments surrounded by rivers of traffic. Again, very true. He also noted the excessive number of doors in Manhattan, many more than one would find in London or Paris, and how in Manhattan, most of the pavements sloped away from the buildings, the better to allow rainwater to drain into the gutter. Another example, one amongst hundreds, illustrating how Harry saw things aslant, was his choice of subject for his only art monograph. Not the famous Italian painter Giambattista Tiepolo, but his overlooked but equally talented son, Gian Domenico Tiepolo. To conclude, it's worth pointing out that just before he died, Harry quizzed me about two items he was planning to allude to in his final unfinished poem. The first was the location of a particular railway disaster which took place in mid-19th century Scotland. The second query was about the Russian painter Kazimir Malevich's late figurative paintings, not about the early abstract paintings for which Malevich is now famous, but the unfashionable later works, evidence that Harry's viewpoint was aslant to the very end. Thank you. The next speaker will be Anne Beattie.
At a pre-Christmas dinner last year, the hostess brought out wrapped presents, not in boxes, handing them out quickly, no names attached, some so large they looked like rumpled bed pillows, punched many times in desperation to make them comfortable. Harry didn't get the largest package, and I don't remember who did. Silver sparkles fell to the table, noisemakers were making noise, wine shimmered and sloshed dangerously in glasses. Someone received a small drone, which instantly took off, bumping the ceiling but remaining undamaged, swiping the Christmas tree limbs studded with antique ornaments that stood just behind Harry as non-Santa shot upward. "What is that?" Harry said with delight. All three words elided into one, shoulders still hunched in a reflexive cringe. "A drone," Harry said. "Marie, I want one." Possibly I remember this because he said so simply what he wanted, because you could always sense the amazed child in the man's body, because he liked fun and he also liked small disasters. The person who adored systems and routine was equally pleased when things went awry. He'd look at you to see whether you didn't appreciate a little disorder as well. Because who could believe life was predictable? And to the extent that it was, he preferred to travel, always a way to shake things up. He enlisted others as his co-conspirators. He was loyal to his friends, even when what might have been a secret wink became instead a roll of the eyes. He so loved Marie and his family and his friends, but I think that since his spirit hovers, he would be more than open to the possibility of a drone whizzing in now to discombobulate everyone. In part, that is what his so inventive writing did. He was puckish, and as he might point out, that quality allowed him to circle the globe.
I'm going to read something that's written in the form of Joe Brainerd's I Remember, which some of you may know Georges Perec took up as Je me souviens, and Harry, when he wrote his appreciation after Perec's death, used that form himself for The Orchard. I remember that for a long time, saying the name Harry Mathews had the power to form an instant bond in certain circles, and that the people who responded to his name were always people with whom you were happy to have an instant bond. I remember that when I was writing my undergraduate thesis on Laura writing, and none of her books were in print, Harry Mathews, who was my thesis advisor, lent me a 2-foot-high stack of Laura writing rarities and told me to make sure to give them back to him when I was finished. I remember thinking, I can't believe Harry Mathews is trusting me, a mere college student whose life is nothing if not chaotic, with his Laura writing first editions. I remember Harry Mathews counseling me not to send my thesis to Laura writing because she was sure to hate it and denounce me personally, and that I foolishly ignored his advice. I remember that the same thing happened to him when he wrote a long laudatory article about her for the New York Review of Books. I remember that I safely returned every last one of Harry Mathews' Laura writing books. I remember that when Harry Mathews first came to Bennington College before he took a job there, I noticed him and poet Georges Guy, who ran the French department, walking around campus wearing matching trench coats and looking like characters from a 1940s movie. I remember that when Harry Mathews said he wouldn't reveal the procedure underlying one of his texts, he meant what he said. I remember that the last time I saw Harry Mathews on the Rue de Grenelle, when my partner Heather Bauza and I went to see him in the fall of 2016, he was excited at having completed a new novel and enjoyed telling us the details of his agent's quest for a publisher. I remember that Harry Mathews' third novel, The Sinking of Outredeck Stadium, was rejected by 25 publishers before it found a home. I remember that although Harry Mathews was close friends with many artists, he never wrote any art criticism, except for one short monograph for a French publisher. I remember thinking that I couldn't understand why, of all the artists in the world to choose from, he would decide to write a book on Gian Domenico Tiepolo. I remember thinking that I should ask Harry why, and that I never did. I remember how talented Harry Mathews was in the art of friendship. I remember how unperturbed Harry Mathews was by the fact that two of his closest writer friends acquired far greater fame than he did. I remember once as I was leaving Harry Mathews' apartment after a visit, he pressed on to me David Markson's Wittgenstein's Mistress. It had just come out and he had an extra copy. I remember Harry Mathews telling me that since I was such a fan of David Markson, I should give him a call, and I remember how regretful I felt after Markson died for not following his suggestion. I remember every meal I ever had with Harry Mathews, even though most of the details of what we ate and said are lost in cascades of judiciously chosen wine. I remember that Harry Mathews sometimes sported a vest furnished with multiple pockets to hold his various writing implements. I remember that in a writing class I took with him, Harry Mathews talked a lot about Werner Erhard and Est, and how at the beginning of the semester a number of students rolled their eyes at the idea that Est had anything useful for their writing, and how by the end of the term they were totally convinced otherwise. I remember that when I shared with Harry Mathews the difficulties of my divorce, he wrote to me how he once took part in a radio program on France Culture called 50 choses que je voudrais faire avant de mourir, 50 things I would like to do before I die, and how, in his words, one of my wishes was to bequeath to humanity a pleasant way for a couple to separate, and how he added, unsurprisingly, the wish remains unfulfilled. I remember Harry Mathews' generosity. I remember Harry Mathews didn't seem to have time for nostalgia. I remember that Harry Mathews wrote the only non-cringy sex scene in a contemporary novel in Cluth, where an erotic encounter is narrated using spoonerisms and all manner of letter and word substitutions, so that almost none of the words are recognizable, and yet the reader can follow along perfectly. I remember how proud Harry Mathews was whenever he concocted a new form or procedure that could then be put to use by other writers. I remember that Harry Mathews had more words of praise for other writers than any other writer I have ever met. I remember that the only occasion I ever heard Harry Mathews speak critically of another writer was when he said of Jean-Jacques Schul's memoir novel, Ingrid Kavan, a book I don't think he really liked at all, that it could have been better. I remember Harry Mathews saying to a class of young writers that nothing was impossible in writing. And to demonstrate this, he gave us one impossible assignment after another. Rewrite a text using only the vocabulary from an entirely different text. Translate a page written in an unfamiliar foreign language without consulting a dictionary. Create a piece of automatic writing, utilizing a list of 100 obligatory words. Every time we got one of these assignments, we had no idea how to proceed. But since our teacher had given us the assignment, it had to be done, it must be done, and it was done. In my case, the results often turned out to be the best things I'd ever written. After the rewriting assignment, I remember naively asking Harry Mathews if this was how John Ashbery wrote his poems, and Harry patiently telling me that it was not. I remember how shocked most of the writing class was when Harry Mathews announced on the first day that there would be no self-expression allowed during the semester. I remember Harry Mathews telling me about his unsuccessful attempts to convince John Ashbery of the lyrical genius of Serge Gainsbourg. I remember how much Harry Mathews relished telling the story of the hoax involving some apocryphal Raymond Roussel documents that he and Perec perpetrated on an unsuspecting French editor. I remember Harry Mathews once telling me how awed he was by an evening he spent in the company of Marie Schex and the singer Barbara. I remember how much Harry Mathews relished recounting the history of how he met Marie Schex, the love of his life. I remember that despite a 15-month-long horror story of medical troubles, his words, Harry Mathews told me that he was still managing to enjoy life because he had just finished his 7th novel, was about to start organizing his collected poems, and had recently celebrated 40 years of living with Marie Schex. I remember I used to judge the quality of a bookstore by whether it carried any books by Harry Mathews, and I still do. I remember that in Camera Ardente, his text in memory of his friend Italo Calvino, Harry Mathews wrote, "Confronted with death, we console ourselves as we can. And by console, I mean distract, and by we, I mean I." I remember that Trevor Winkfield asked everyone who was speaking tonight not to go over 7 minutes, which must count as a constraint. I remember that the only value of a literary constraint is, as Harry Mathews put it, that since you are unable to say what you normally would, you must say what you normally wouldn't. I remember, when I think of Harry Mathews and how full and short our lives are, that our ultimate constraint is time. Thank you.
When Trevor very generously asked me to participate this evening, I immediately knew what I wanted to read. And then I only recently learned that Tina Packer had precisely the same thought. So I have to thank Tina for very graciously altering her plan for this evening so that I could read this being just the last 4 paragraphs from Harry's 4th novel, Cigarettes, which, as you know, is dedicated to the memory of Georges Perec. Hold on, I made a few notes just in case. The jacket copy describes this as Harry's masterpiece. I take the view that all of Harry's novels are masterpieces. And I first read Cigarettes in the spring of 1996. And as it happened, my father died that Easter, very unexpectedly, in his mid-50s. And I read these same paragraphs at his funeral. I think to the puzzlement of most people in attendance, this was a very small village church in South Wales, actually very near a large hill called the Bloringe, which Harry was delighted to learn of the existence of, I think through Kenneth Coke, because he'd long wanted to rhyme orange with a word in a quatrain, and was thus able to do so. I think I intuited that these words were true in 1996, and now over 20 years later, and particularly since the death of many close friends in the past 2 years, I know them to be true. I also became middle-aged last week, so I have to do this. I thought, in other words, that I could always recover. I was only beginning to learn that the dead stay everlastingly present among us, taking the form of palpable vacancies that only disappear when, as we must, we take them into ourselves. We take the dead inside us, we fill their voids with our own substance, we become them. The living dead do not belong to a race of fantasy, they constitute the inhabitants of our earth. The longer we live, the more numerous the inviting holes death opens in our lives, and the more we add to the death inside us, until at last we embody nothing else. And when we in turn die, those who survive embody us, the whole of us, our individual selves and the crowd of dead men and women we have carried within us. Your father dies, you hear his laugh resounding in your lungs. Your mother dies, in a store window you catch yourself walking with her huddled gait. A friend dies, you strike his pose in front of an expectant camera. Beyond these outward signs, we take up the foibles, the gifts, the unrealized failures and successes of those we have watched and watched die. Of course, we do everything in our power to deny this. I shall deny it to you and to myself as long as I speak, still pretending that you are only you, and I. In this way, I can become altogether blind and go on groping my way through sunlight and darkness, with only my uncomprehending complaints to furnish names for the things I trip over and for the other sightless bodies I stumble against. In such circumstances, I sometimes think that only the residual strength of the dead beings inside me gives me power to survive at all. By that I mean both the accumulated weight of the generations succeeding one another, and, as well, from the first of times, when names held their objects fast and light shone among us in miracles of discovery, the immortal presence of that original and heroic actor who saw that the world had been given him to play in, without remorse or fear. Thank you, Harry, for the extraordinary riches you've left us.
My relationship with Harry, my long friendship, was a combination of shared love for literature and people. I was in New York working as a social worker at the Metropolitan Hospital, and I was working in the psychiatric ward. And it was a very stressful situation, not so much because of the patients, but because the structure of the hospital had to treat these people was constantly misfiring. So there was really no way to do a good job. And maybe that made me receptive when I encountered Harry's writing and the Oulipo to the importance of structure. A friend of mine visiting from Detroit said, I'm reading a book by a guy who looks like your brother. And it was cigarettes. And I picked it up and couldn't stop reading it. And I was taking at this time at the St. Mark's Poetry Project's Saturday afternoon class, a workshop with the poet John Yao, who said, do you like that book? And I said, I love it. He said, you should send him your work. He'd like your work, which is probably the best thing anyone had ever said to me. I never thought of myself as a writer. I was a big reader, but so the next week, sure enough, he brought this long, to me, convoluted address in the French Alps, Lanzan-Vincourt. And he said, you should send him your story. You should send him one of your stories. And I carried it around with me for a long time, and I thought, well, I'll write him about cigarettes. And then I had read a great book by Lynn Tillman called Haunted Houses, and I noticed Harry had a quote on the back. So I thought, you know what, I can talk about haunted houses, cigarettes. If he likes my story, great. If not, at least we can establish a literary connection. But he did like the story. He said in the note back, you should look Lynn Tillman up if you like her. Here's her phone number, which is, back in that time. And I called Lynn, and she met me, and we became very, very good friends. So when Harry came to New York, he said, I have to meet you. I was very nervous. I felt he was cosmopolitan, and I was this Detroit, Flint, Michigan person, and I really wasn't sure how it would go. But we met in this very low-key Irish bar, lots of cheap wine, maybe the one time in his life, but it was flowing. And when the waitress came around with hors d'oeuvres, he was like, cheese toasts. as if it was the most delightful thing ever. He was just, and one thing that was very clear in this meeting was how important Marie was to him, and he explained to me how they met and talked about their relationship and really wanted me to come to lunch to meet Marie, which I did. And we just sort of had a lifelong friendship. I mean, a few years later, Harry and Marie and Lynn Tillman came to my wedding in Detroit. I have a picture of my now 22-year-old son in Key West with Harry singing Italian opera to him, doing this. I actually was in the very difficult situation when Harry was teaching the master writing class here once. He was ill and asked me to teach it for him because he had trained me to do it. I could not say no, but my heart just cringed for these poor students, thinking they're getting Harry Mathews, and then they didn't. But it turned out to be great, and I've actually since taught that workshop. Anyone who has spent any time with Harry, that sometimes he would respond immediately, and sometimes there would be a pause when you said something, and you really weren't sure if it was something withering was gonna come. Like one time he said to me, "Don't ever talk that way at a cocktail party." And then sometimes it would be, "Oh, that's absolutely right." But there was really never any way to tell. So that ties into the very end of this story. But I want to just also say that my husband, John, and Harry went fishing in Key West. He gave John his father's fishing rod. There were just so many friendship, but we were also really bonded with literature. The last few years when he was sick, I think what really broke his heart was his fear that he was putting a lot of stress on Marie. And he would say, "I'm in pain, but I just, Marie is this vibrant, beautiful woman, and I just hope I'm not putting too much stress on her." And it was so wonderful when he said a couple of years ago, "Can I send you my new novel, The Solitary Twin? Can I send it to you?" And I was so thrilled that it was not just good, it was brilliant. It was a gem. It was just so lovely. And I feel kind of like that, having achieved that and having translated it really eased his mind from his pain and his concern about Marie. The last time I talked to him, I said, "Harry, there's a lot of things I like about you. Your loyalty, your writing, your friendship. You're easy on the eyes. But if I had to pick one thing, my favorite quality of you is Marie." And without a beat, he said, "Mine too. Absolutely mine too."
Evening. I've got middle-aged too. In addition to being a dear friend, Harry Mathews was for me a great mentor in the arts of verbal expression. Yet when I think about him, it's often in visual terms. And this evening, I wanted to share 3 images in particular that have remained imprinted on my brain over the years. 3 visions of Harry, if you will. The first was that magnificent jug jaw, which I first encountered in the photograph by Betsy Baker that adorns the back cover of The Sinking of the Adriatic Stadium. The book was given to me by the French novelist Maurice Roche, who I'd recently met. I was 17, in Paris and on my own for the first time, and I'd met Maurice through one of those sets of circumstances that you can't make up. I had begun translating Maurice's latest novel, Codex, and was fancying myself quite the young literary hotshot. All the more so in that I'd never translated anything before in my life and had no idea what I was doing. Still, things were going along just fine, my sense of smugness growing by leaps and bounds, despite what Rimbaud said, one can be very serious when one is 17, until the evening Maurice handed me that big fat triple volume by his other American translator, this Harry Mathews bloke. Even more than the fact that this person had published 3 novels, even more than that he had preceded me in translating an author that I felt I had discovered, what disturbed me most was the adultness of that large face, the self-assured half-smile, the waggish little cigar dangling off his fingers. Who was I fooling? How could I think I could translate anything, write anything, pretend to anything? Looking at Harry's portrait brought home, in a cold slap of reality, that there were real writers and translators out there who knew exactly what they were doing, while I was just a kid playing at moving words around my little line notebook. It was a precious lesson in humility, for which I remain forever grateful. My second image of Harry is of a monolithic finger. Several years after my fateful encounter with this photo, I screwed up my courage enough to read the conversions, immediately deciding it was the best thing since sliced participles. By that time, I had joined Random House as a fledgling junior MIDI sub-editor, and I decided it was my mission to bring Harry back home, since it was, after all, Random House that had first published the novel. I was fortunate enough to meet Harry's agent, Maxine Grofsky, and began bombarding her with requests to see his next book as soon as it was delivered, figuring I could compensate for my lack of experience or industry status by making such a pest of myself that Maxine would send me the manuscript just so I'd go away. Well, it didn't happen at Random House, but one fine day, when I was working at the late lamented Weidenfeld and Nicholson, a manuscript showed up, in a jiffy bag, in a box, on paper, also late lamented, with on the title page the words, "Cigarettes, a novel by Harry Mathews." I immediately took it home and read it, was mystified, was enraptured, and managed to convince the powers that were to let me publish it. And then began the wonderful and painstaking process of editing. Every afternoon, Harry and I sat side by side in my office, going over the manuscript word by word and line by line. And for every suggested word change, every queried comma, every recommended deletion, his finger would stab at the graphite mark I'd made on his page, definite, imperious, but to the point. And we'd debate the pros and cons of the proposed amendment. This went on for a solid week, and on the last day, Harry brought in a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, and, the final comma parsed, we toasted a successful and highly enjoyable collaboration. My last image is of Harry's back. After the publications of Cigarettes, after I was fortunate enough to count him not only as an author but as a friend, he would come periodically to my and my wife's apartment for dinner. On one occasion, in a mild fall evening, as our small gathering was just taking our digestif out into the terrace to enjoy the late-season warmth, the cassette player that had been humming in the background came on with Stevie Wonder's Signed, Sealed, Delivered. Harry, heading out to the terrace, raised his arms above his head and gave a little shimmy that expressed all the openness and spontaneous joie de vivre that made being in his company such a pleasure. This is the image I like to retain of him, now that he has moved on. Gleefully boogalooing his way into the beyond, through the doorway, ready to meet whatever comes next with all the exuberance in the universe. Thank you.
My thanks to Marie for putting me on the list, and Trevor for managing so much, and there were others I know. Familiar faces here, and they make me think of the many ways that we knew Harry. Yes, maybe I should be over here. The many faces that I know and sometimes cannot attach names to remind me of the many ways in which we knew Harry and Harry us. A trek up and down several canyons in New Mexico in search of the shrine of the stone lions, a fierce squash match at Beekman Place, readings we gave, including one Harry asked me to join him in for his friend George Perec, whom he had brought into my life, many copies of Harry's books inscribed to me, so encouraging as he constantly was. One in which he said I had taught him how to be a friend. An odd moment after a conversation between the two of us in front of a large audience in Brooklyn, and I thought just maybe I might have rubbed him the wrong way, introducing Oulipo with more emphasis than I myself give it in Harry's writing and his aesthetic. So much more to his work than that. Blake says, in opposition is true friendship. I think not of that so much as subtle differences, personal style, vivid strength in Harry, his hilarious humor and elan, and later on, the courage of good manners when he was sometimes physically suffering. Wild, too, in his imaginings. This is an authority on sinking stadiums. An explosive, if you remember, all over comic release, his reference where the passenger seat companion in a car careering onward pleads, "Let me take the wheel," and W.C. Fields hands it to him. That seems to sum up a side of Harry. And here tonight, remembering not only when I was there, but when I wasn't, which can be experienced too. Even like the limit, the constraint, Harry often called it, that a fixed form may impose on you and yet yield strange, encouraging surprises as you work within it and yourself. Harry and I embarked on a series of poems, each answering the previous one, a series only embarked on, if that, sestinas. Did Harry say to me, "Joe, it's impossible to write a bad sestina"? Yes, he did say that. And he sent me at least once the 6 words for me to use in a sestina, arbitrary, since they came from him, as he felt they should be. I thought to read you my 6, first of all, tonight, but let me not. You will hear them. 2 are hardly arbitrary. 1 is in the title of his, I believe, final novel, The Solitary Twin, now posthumously to be published. Poignant, I felt, disturbing, witty, secret, revealing. My title tonight, Sestina for Harry, has a dedication which is at least as important, if not more important, and for Marie. In my sestina, the you is Harry, but then it is us, and then at last, Harry. First reading. Not sure you're here or where in solitary splendor. Truth, our life and letters, not a wreck waiting to happen quite yet. Your absence less raw than real. Dark, stormy, bright as the keys of your Florida piano. The constraint like your upright performing, a wheel in a wheel, on a roll, like earth less than we'll know, who, turning every which way, recall some solitary hope you understood of ours, where the constraint was to live all you can. If today you're a wreck, tomorrow discovering what? The keys in pocket where you left them. All the raw material, your double espresso thermosed against a raw wind whipping home plate dust at Shea. Or a wheel of brie, less needed in my then raw downtown space of keys aflow with life force than of my solitary stove, it seemed, third-hand magic chef, or my wrecking bar. Clarified butter you asked for, arriving. Constraint making do with the years. What stranded constraint, alive on an island we thought up. My job, raw fish to spear. Bill Gass, record keeper. Our very shipwreck, driftwood for Harry to cook on. Spar, mast, even wheel. Survival, mysterious. No solitary, Chenetier, our 4th, but his job, keys to the island, the salt, a future, a life. Words keys only sometimes. Say, Paris, Toulouse, silence, constraint. In Siena one night, when Calvino lay gone, solitary the hours till dawn of your wake for him, raw-boned American friend, life's own fame of itself will spin into, then out of control, this mute wreck we embody for you, Schubert, Perec, say, brothering posthumous keys to us, many and one, our wheel spinning I to E absence, constraint, to twin fullness by you. Writer at risk in the raw, you knew in us And you, solitary what? Raw rookies, postseason constraint? Keys left to our reckoning hopes? The wheel to windward, solitary, west by east. Thank you.
Trevor suggested that I read some of Harry's poetry. So within 7 minutes, there's a lot of poetry. Anyway, I think it's 7, and I decided that I would read a little sample from 2 sequences that Harry wrote, which I love. The first is called Trial Impressions, and it's a series of takeoffs on a Renaissance song by John Dowland, which usually goes by the first line. And I thought I would read that first and then read 3 or 4 of Harry's variations. Dear, if you change, I'll never choose again. Sweet, if you shrink, I'll never think of love. Fair, if you fail, I'll judge all beauty vain. Wise, if too weak, my wits I'll never prove. Dear, sweet, fair, wise, change, shrink nor be not weak, and on my faith shall never break. Earth with her flowers shall sooner heaven adorn, heaven her bright stars through earth's dim globe shall move. Fire heat shall lose, and frosts of flame be born, air made to shine as black as hell shall prove. Earth, heaven, fire, air, the world transformed shall view, ere I prove false to faith, or strange to you. Here's Harry's first. If you break our breakfast date, I'll go begging in Bangkok. If you start stalling, I'll stop everything. If you phone that freak, I'll fall down Everest. If you take that trip, please tow away my truck. A date, a freak, a trip, I implore you to be careful. I don't claim to be reasonable, I just can't stop. We can't take this sharp awareness into yesterday. No pondered memory of tomorrow can exalt it. Can black holes yield light? Can sunlight weigh more than stone? Can the split atom be reassembled? When today is tomorrow, and the electrons rejoin each other, only then will my unreasonableness fail to invest you. Here's the first half of the next one. Dear, if you, who are more pole star than polecat, change, I'll never, when confronted with life's many-paged bill of fare, choose any dish, no matter how succulent, again. Sweet and pretty as an advancing spinnaker, if you shrink like a boiled sweater, I'll never so much as think of the high rental havens of love. Fair like sun in an Alp, if you fail to be what you seem, I'll judge all beauty like the new bills of a drifting currency, pretentious and vain. Wise, if too winning for many to believe it, don't let your wisdom turn into the weak, indecisive, busy signal that flabbergasts my wits, leaving them with nothing to prove. Dear pole star, sweet spinnaker, fair Alp, winning wisdom, never change, never shrink, never fail, never be weak. And by my bank account, my nervous system, my mind, and my faith, complex as a computer and simple as the current it runs on, shall never break. I think two more of these, and then I'll read just a tiny bit from another sequence. By the way, some of these have, they're numbered in the sequence, but some of them have titles following. The title following this one is Male Chauvinist. You're a pain, and as long as you hang around, I'll keep playing the field. You're a kvetch, and if you don't give me some room, there are friendlier beds. If you can't keep your potato nose out of my affairs, prettier faces can console me. What makes a dope like you so sure of herself? I know my own mind. Pain, kvetch, potato nose, dope, keep acting this way, and as sure as there's sand and spinach, I'll keep kicking your ass. Do you think the human race is going to migrate to the bottom of the sea? Are you waiting for edible fish to start nesting on your windowsill? Why not fill your gas tank with ice and wash your laundry in the oven? Why not plan to take your next dream vacation in Newark? But if you moved to Newark, built a fish nest in your oven, and spent all your time underwater, I still wouldn't trust you. Here's the last one from the sequence. There are, I think, 30 of them. I could hardly expect you to love me if I couldn't make up my mind about you. If I thought love was pointless, how could I fail to repulse you? I wouldn't expect your support if I derided beauty as skin deep. If I was a jerk, why should your intelligence tolerate it? Who wants to fly his rocket ship through solid rock? Who cares for strolling on the unpaved void of night? Who takes icicles to bed in winter? Who likes his ice cream boiled? Nobody wants that kind of world. Please agree. Okay, so I'm just going to read a tiny bit of this next one. It's titled Haikus Before Sleep. I think there are about 100 of them. I'll just read 6 or 8, something like that. Oysters would have helped. Neither they nor Golden Bream were for sale today. "2:30 a.m. I must be Frank O'Hara or a disciple. Sky is all today. The sky is following me. Nonsense, says the drink. A 6-year-old boy looks at me as someone real. No time for fuck-ups. My nails are warping, my knees have no cartilage. Sunset, mauve, orange. Makes me want to cry, the light like golden music, Marie's vinaigrette. From where in the world is my wife looking at me? Not under the bed. And 2 more. Haikus are diffic. Haikus are very diffic. One haiku is diff. And this is the last one in the sequence. Struggling to preserve what? This piece of shit? Utterly worth it.
Yeah, right here on this monitor in front of me is the same thing you're looking at up on that screen. It's a really beautiful image. I was telling someone before we started that you and the audience are going to look at that image, and then you're going to look at the person speaking, and then look back at the image. Honestly, it's kind of hard for me to get my head around Harry's not being here. So what follows are just some scattershot impressions and memories. Not really. I think the coherence, if there is any in them, will be found in Harry himself. I first learned about Harry by reading the first issue. Well, I heard about him through Kenneth Koch back in about 1960, but the first thing I read by Harry was in the first issue of Locus Solus. It was the first chapter of the Conversions, and I was so knocked out by it, by the prose, that I just seemed to lock into it. The prose locked me into it, and I never got out of being locked into Harry's writing after that, ever. But when I sort of first met, I don't remember first meeting him, but I remember when I first kind of got to know him was in Paris in 1965. I and my young wife had gone over there. I was a student and graduate student, I guess you'd say. And anyway, my wife and I were living in a Fleabag hotel, and Harry was going to be going off to Laos. Someone mentioned that earlier. This is in the fall of '65. And Maxine Grosky, I think, probably told Harry that we were living in this terrible hotel. And Harry very generously just said, well, take my apartment. And so we went from this Fleabag to this wonderful apartment on the Rue de Varennes, just down the street from the Russian embassy. And everything was like, wow. And it was there that, living in somebody else's house, you really kind of get to know them in a funny way. And
I was really struck by his absolute generosity at that point. And then it was either shortly after he got back, one night, it was I think a Saturday night or Sunday night, it was about midnight, and somehow I and my wife were talking with Harry, I don't remember where, maybe at his apartment, and the subject of Belgian beer came up. And I didn't know anything about Belgian beer. I hardly drank at all. And Harry said, "Oh, it's absolutely marvelous. You must experience it." And I said, "Well, I will." And he said, "No, come now." And he dragged us down, and we got in a little tiny car he had, and he drove about 100 miles an hour across Paris to some obscure bar that specialized in Belgian beer. And he ordered about 4 or 5 of them and said, "Oh, try this one now, try this one now." And it was absolutely incredible. It was just like, oh my God. And speaking of drinking, I remember a time early on too, he and Maxine Grofsky and John Ashbery and my wife and I, they took us out to one of Harry's restaurants called Chez Yvonne, and he introduced us to pastis that night. We didn't know what that was, and we thought it was like soda pop, so we drank about 3 or 4 of them, and wine and a wonderful dinner. And I remember we staggered out into the evening, and we're walking back toward this end, and I remember we stopped, and I looked up, and there was a wall in front of me, a floodlit wall. It was just a wall, nothing on it. And I was not used to drinking. I was totally drunk. And I said to Harry, I said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's the Louvre." Another time, he told me, and I know I have this story all wrong, but I'm going to tell it anyway, is he was working on a film in Italy. He was writing a treatment or a script or something, and he told me that one night in the hotel there, all these people were the stars. Somebody was shooting a film. I don't know what it was, a movie thing, and his door was unlocked, and someone sort of knocked on the door very late at night, and he said, "Come in," and Brigitte Bardot came in wearing this very filmy nightgown and ran across and flung herself onto his bed with him and said, "Oh, Harry, I'm so lonely." I know I have that wrong, but it's... Another time, Harry learned that my wife and I were going to be going to Umbria, and where we'd never been before, and I think we told him we were going to Perugia, and he said, "Oh, Perugia, you must go to Spello." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "It's a very small town near Perugia. You must go there." And I said, "Well, what's?" He said, "It's very, very small." I said, "Well, what's there?" And he said, "Oh, you don't know? There's the great Pinturicchio works in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore." And I said, "Oh, okay, I'll go." And he said, "One thing you should notice, after you've looked at the works by Pinturicchio, you must, to do that, you have to put money in a box that will turn on the lights for 90 seconds or something." And he said, "You must bring plenty of change." So I said, "Oh, okay." And then when we actually got there, and we put money in the box, and it went thunk. The lights came on, and we looked, and they went off, thunk. And then later, Harry told me, "Yes, did you notice the little woman down at the edge? She has a switch. She turns it on and off." But he also said, after you've looked at the Pinturicchios, go next door there's a marvelous restaurant called Il Molino, I think it was called. And there, they have the most fabulous, and he told me exactly what to eat. He was absolutely right on absolutely everything he ever recommended to me. But it seemed like no matter where you had mentioned, he knew where all the best things were. And one of my favorite books of his is his book on Gian Domenico Tiepolo. I think it's hard to find. It's kind of very expensive and out of print and a weird publisher. But if you get a chance, read that book. It's just a wonderful. It really just. It's exactly the kind of art writing people should be doing, and they don't. Okay, just a couple of more things. When somebody wrote to me not too long ago and asked to contribute one thing about Harry, I don't know what it's for, something online maybe, I don't know. But and the first thing that came to my mind was Harry had a wonderful look in his eye when either he was just about to tell you something very witty, or you were just about to tell him something very witty, and it was a wonderful impish glint that showed. It was like the kernel of eternal pleasure that was going to burst forth for a moment as soon as this thing happened, and it always did. And it was a look that you don't see in too many people's eyes. I don't have it, but Harry had it, and it was always so wonderful to watch that glint just grow, and then boom, there it was. It was very beautiful. So anyway, when I first met him, he was honestly intimidating to me because I felt very unsophisticated, which I was, and very unworldly. And Harry was so cosmopolitan, international. He knew every city. He knew every great thing about every place. He was so smart. He knew how to play the piano. He knew music well. He knew art. He seemed to know everything. And to me, he was a model of sophistication. In fact, he gave sophistication and connoisseurship a good name, and that's hard to find. And underneath it all, I discovered, after I stopped being intimidated by his fantastic presence, I saw he was a very sweet man, and he had a very tender heart, and he was quite wonderful, actually. Thank you.
Hello. I'm not going to go behind that thing if you don't mind. You can all hear me, okay? I have known Harry for all my life. I ran away at 18 to Paris, and I found an American painter called Bill Waldron, and we were living outside Paris in a wing of a chateau, and he said, Harry and Nicky are coming up tonight. They will come up from L'Ensemble, a place they had just bought, and they will stay the night. Now, I'd gone to Paris because I absolutely wanted to live with artists, you know. I was still at school. I thought, this is where it all happens. Anyway, Nicky and Harry came up, and they were fantastic. They were young and sexy in my eye, the embodiment of what it meant to be an artist. And Bill Waldron and Harry started getting drunker and drunker. Bill was a Shoshone Indian, and in part, and so he believed that they should be blood brothers. So they both slashed their wrists, right, with blood flowing, and they're mingling their bloods with each other, so that we would be friends forever, which we were. I didn't slash anything, but I did mingle a bit. Anyway, that was at the beginning of my relationship with Harry. And then 2 years later, when Bill Waldron turned out to be a shit and threw me out, who rescued me but Harry and Nicky, and gave me the money to go back to England. And then we began this kind of relationship from afar. Nicky and Harry broke up, but then suddenly Harry was in a terrible state at one point because his son had run away. And so he came to England. So we started this kind of process of saving each other, if I can put it like that. I know it's not very literary, but honest to God, it was worth every ounce. And, anyway, when I left my husband 7 years later, of course, what I did was to drive, not even telling Harry I was coming, down to L'Ensemble because I wanted to leave and make sure that I couldn't be found by this man, also that I didn't like by this time. And indeed, fortunately, Harry was there and looked after me for the next month. Now, I'd worked out that my ex-husband by this time would find me in about a month's time, because he'd go to everywhere and then he'd suddenly think Harry Mathews. And the day before he turned up, Harry said, you should go back to England now, of course giving me the wherewithal to go back to England. and indeed then having to deal with a very irate husband that turned up the next day. So this kind of thing, but Harry's writing used to make me really mad. I could think, how can such a sensitive, deep person write this stuff so frivolously? You know, it made me really angry. I remember throwing Toulouse across the room, or maybe it was the sinking of the Underground. Anyway, I don't know, but I remember being really angry because I didn't get it. But of course, as time went on, and I became first a Shakespeare actor, and then I created my own company, and I have to say, again, when I was creating my company, Harry went with me to a lot of my early fundraising appointments, and he'd tell me, you've got to change that frock, Tina, you can't go like that. And off we would trot, he as my incipient board member, to show that I was respectable and not stupid and did know what I was talking about. And so he would come with me and he helped me form Shakespeare Company, and then came onto the board of trustees for that. I have to say he was the only board of trustees that actually put themselves through this very intense workshop we do called the January Intensive, in which we do voice and movement and Shakespeare text in great depth, and we do things like mask work and clown work. Well, we were living in Edith Wharton's house, so it was appropriate that Harry should create a writing workshop in Edith Wharton's house. But what he decided was we would all do neutral mask and then write like mad after we'd come out of neutral mask. I don't know if you can imagine this, but neutral mask is usually mute, so you don't say anything. You put the mask on, you turn and look at the audience, it's very spooky. But then he took it a step further. We were all going to write out of this, and we did. And we did extraordinary things. And he was my savior and my best friend. His presence allowed me to know that I could do it, and that he would be there to catch me if, in fact, I was going to fail. And a couple of times, oh God. One more story about the company. The company's flourishing and doing extraordinarily well now, and I know he would be so proud. But there was one time when we needed an enormous sum of money to get into the season, and we didn't know how we'd do it. But we'd worked out with the cash flow how it all could be paid off within a year. We just need somebody to do it. So Dennis, my husband, rang up Harry and said, Harry, we don't know quite how to do it. And there's a pause. And he said, I won't say that I won't drink champagne and eat caviar. I will always drink champagne and eat caviar. But your figures have got to be straight this time. A theatre company, God. Anyway, he made it possible for us to get into that season. And it is true, our figures were just about straight. It took us about maybe a year longer than we told him that it would. But it did, and we did do it. So I tell you this, but but the thing about Harry was when we really were into the Shakespeare, that I began to understand his work much better, because I started realizing that he was always writing about what couldn't be seen or what was underneath the form of what he was doing. And of course, with Shakespeare, the form and the content align. And so I started learning about how he was aligning his extreme forms to the content. And so I got a really much greater understanding and depth of what his work was actually about. And I was going to read some of this as well. But anyway, I'm just going to do one poem, which is so typical of him. This is from, what's it called? Close Encounters? No, Out of Bounds. Great title that he has. But he's building on Ben Jonson's imitation of Catullus, Let's play every joke love affords while we still can grab it. Our years have been counted. Morning in, morning out, the sun will rise. But when jittery dusk overcomes our poor light, night will follow endlessly. We have no cause to adjourn our skillful, bumpy pleasures. I just love the way he mixes Anglo-Saxon words with long Latinate words. We have no cause to adjourn our skillful, bumpy pleasures. Let us make various play of opinions and reputations and judiciously bewilder the curiosity of the nosy jerks around us. Let's cop our melons where they grow and never tell anyone the sober facts. After all, sin is only a fact that sticks. You and I avoiding it, spit in rumor's busy jaws and not stop play until the last dark falls. And I last saw Harry, a month before he died, and I had no idea he was going to die. I knew he was really sick, but he still was laughing and joking, and what concerned him more than anything was that Marie, was having to spend all her energy focusing on him. And so I came up with the bright idea that I should come and focus on him and she should go off. Except it turned out I didn't know how to do all the things I was meant to be doing. But I have to say, I felt that that he, it's very hard to think of him being dead. And it's very, and the cigarettes, the reading where he says, parts of us get carried round and you see your parents and your mother as you pass by the window, or your best friend in the way you pick up a pen or something like that. And I think all that is true. And it seems to me that the times that I really find that I can hear Harry behind me, or saying that's not true, Tina, or that that we do carry the people who have deeply influenced us and have allowed us to grow and to flourish and to have such good fun as you were doing it. I have, even in the emotional turmoil when we often turn to each other, it was always exciting. It was exciting to think about where the next thing was going to happen or what it is. So, because he's gone, I know my turn's coming dead soon. And part of me thinks, okay, the bits of me that grew and loved with Harry maybe can go into other places. And I suppose just within my own circle, which is not particularly a literary circle, but a theatrical circle, that in fact it did pass on, that we did create workshops, that we did do those things. So thank you, Marie, for allowing me to speak and for being such a dear friend over these years, and thank you, Trevor. And I'm glad you left England, really.
Thank you, Trevor. Just a few words. I'm not a participant to this, I just want to say a few words. We had a memorial for Harry in Paris last May, where we showed a short 3-4 minutes film mainly pictures of Harry and family photographs. I'd like to share with you these intimate moments. Before that, you will watch that. Before that, I just want to remind you, I met Harry in Paris in 1976. He happened to be the translator of my first book, The Laurels of Lake Constance. Very early in our relationship, Harry warned me he had given himself 3 rules in case of a long-term affair. First rule, she should be a musician and play an instrument. Second rule, she shouldn't have any children. Third rule, she shouldn't be by any means a writer. So this happy misunderstanding lasted for 40 years.
Where is Rick?
I don't know. I ain't seen him all night.
When will he be back?
Not tonight no more. He ain't coming. He went home.
Does he always leave so early?
Oh, he never. Well, he's got a girl up to the Blue Parrot. Goes up there all the time.
You used to be a much better liar, sir.
Leave him alone, Miss Elsa. You bad luck tonight.
Play it once, Sam. For all time's sake.
I don't know what you mean, Miss Elsa.
Play it, Sam. Play as time goes by.
Oh, I can't remember it, Miss Elsa. I'm a little rusty on it.
I'll hum it for you. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da.
Must remember this, a kiss is still a kiss, a sigh is just a sigh. The fundamental things apply as time goes by. And when two lovers woo, they still say I love you. On that you can rely. No matter what the future brings as time goes by. And love songs are never out of date. Hearts full of passion, jealousy, and hate. Woman needs man, and man must have his mate that no one can deny. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time goes by. Moonlight and love songs are never out of date. Hearts full of passion, jealousy, and hate. Woman needs man, and man must have its mate that no one can deny. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die.